Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Tembusu Forum, the US Presidential and Vice Presidential Debate 2020. May I now first introduce Professor Tommy Ko, Rector of Tembusu College, to say a few words. Prof. Ko, please.
Thank you, Margaret. The United States is a superpower. As a superpower, it has interests in many parts of the world, including here in Southeast Asia and in the larger Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. The countries of this region have a stake in the outcome of the elections on 3rd November. And this is why we're having a mock presidential and vice presidential debate this evening. It has become a tradition of the college to hold such a debate once every 4 years. And I would like to thank Tina Datta very much for coming to the college for the second time. So we have 4 very distinguished speakers for President Trump, Vice President Biden, Vice President Pence, Senator Harris. So let's begin. The person who will now speak for President Trump is Tina Datta, a longtime and valued resident of Singapore. She has her own company that gives strategic advice to companies operating not just in Singapore, but in the larger region. She's a trustee of the Singapore American School and is a friend. So Tina, please speak for President Trump for the next 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Ko. It's my pleasure to be here, and I truly appreciate doing this for the second time. One thing I would like to say specifically on behalf of Republicans around the world today is how grateful we are to President Trump for putting our 3rd Supreme Court justice onto the court today. One of his promises, and my discussion today is going to be about promises made, promises kept, which is why President Trump deserves to be reelected for 4 more years, was to, when justices became available on the Supreme Court, to put conservative justices onto the Supreme Court. And this is the 3rd one, and it was today. So I am a very happy Republican today, and I wanted to make that comment. Having to do with promises made, promises kept. I want you to understand what that actually means. There were many promises that President Trump made in his 2016 convention, the convention for the Republican Party, as well as his campaign. And those promises are many things that presidents do when they run for election, but they don't always live up to the promises that they make to the community and to the public in the United States. But he has done that. And I'd like to go through with a list of things that were the most important accomplishments and the promises that he has lived up to and why he will be reelected. Under President Trump's leadership, Congress passed historic tax cuts, relief for hardworking Americans, and tax cuts, and it's called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was the first major tax reform signed in 30 years. It provided tax relief for 82% of middle-class families, not 10%, but 82% of middle-class families. It doubled the child tax credit, providing an additional $1,000 per child in tax relief for working parents. And it also doubled the standard deduction, a change that simplified the tax filing code for millions and millions of Americans. The economy under President Trump grew at a whopping 3% in 4 quarters under his administration. Prior to the COVID virus in the United States, the economy was growing faster than it had grown in 40 years in the United States. The stock market itself had never reached as high as it had ever been. It was 29,000 on New Year's Eve of January 1st of 2020. And then we all know what happened with COVID. He's made the United States a very competitive market for companies on the world stage, lowering our corporate rate, which was one of the highest in the industrial world under the Obama administration at 35% to 21%. This allowed American companies and international companies to come back to the United States at a lower tax rate to be able to bring jobs and manufacturing back to the United States, as well as repatriate money that had been held overseas because it was too expensive to bring back to the United States, helping the United States tax basis. There are many things that took place under the economic plan for President Trump, and I'm not going to get down into the weeds in it today because I do have a vice president that's very capable to talk to those issues as well. So I'm going to move on to trade and foreign policy. President Trump has kept his promise to crack down on trade and promote fair trade and equal trade for all Americans. In his first year in office, President Trump took action to protect America's critical steel and aluminum industries, which, as we talk about now, watching the election itself, you're watching Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, those states all talking about steel, all talking about oil, all talking about fracking. After an investigation, the Trump administration found that global dumping of steel and aluminum had critically weakened the United States' capacity to produce steel and aluminum. The president exercised his authority to impose a 25% global tariff on steel imports and a 10% global tariff on aluminum imports in order to protect our national industries. This really helped industries open closed mills. This helped Pennsylvania to reopen its steel. This helped West Virginia open its coal. It allowed the workforces that had been out of jobs in many of those states to regain their jobs, maintain, and increase also production in the United States for both steel and coal. He also began renegotiations of trade agreements that contributed to the U.S. trade deficit and harmed American workers. The president agreed and removed the deal that they had signed with Cuba. That trade deal came back to the United States. He renegotiated NAFTA, which is a trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. That took through the first 2 years of his administration, and that finally was agreed to in the Congress, and that's been renegotiated with both of those countries, bringing jobs in cars and washing machines and other things back to the Midwest of the United States, bringing back jobs to Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, and states like that. The Trump administration made enforcement of U.S. trade laws a top priority. It was, as you know, President Trump decided to come directly and start having trade negotiations back with China. They took China to the WTO, talking about the unfair trade of China and in technology, as well as solar panels, as well as washing machines, as well as many other items. It ends up that the United States won those challenges at the WTO. And when winning those challenges, they were able to put the sanctions on the Chinese imports as anti-dumping, protecting jobs in the United States. A commitment that he had while he was running for election, a commitment made, a commitment done. President Trump also, on his foreign policy side, did come on a historic 12-day tour to Asia. He visited 5 countries, and he also came to Singapore. He came to Vietnam. He's been in Korea. Many of these visits were having to do with the negotiations with North Korea, and his engagement with North Korea, as we all know, living here in Asia, has toned down North Korea's outbound aggression in the region. We're not having threats to the United States itself, and while we can say nothing firm was put into contract, and people can say that, there was diplomacy done between both of the countries, with 3 different trips made with efforts on behalf of President Trump, making ASEAN, making Asia safer. President Trump worked with the G20 partners and the World Bank, and they established a fund on behalf of women entrepreneurs of a total of $1 billion. The State Department announced the relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Israel. He withdrew from UNESCO to show they would not stand for any anti-Israeli bias. December 2018 was when the United States officially recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, whether we can agree with that or not agree with that, That was a promise that President Trump made, and that's another promise that President Trump kept. While in office, President Trump worked with Congress to increase defense spending, reverse defense sequesters, and expand our military capacity and modernize its capabilities. The Trump administration worked to rebuild the U.S. military and provide the defense with nearly $1.5 trillion. This was a promise that President Trump made. President Trump made the promise. President Trump fulfilled his promise. We can all agree that maybe we don't like what his promises were, and that's the difference between Republicans and Democrats. But he ran on a platform, he made promises, and he has fulfilled those promises to the American people. President Trump worked on removing regulations in the United States so that the economy could move forward. One of another promises that President Trump made. He made an executive order mandating that 2 regulations must be eliminated for every regulation created in order to reduce compliance costs for industry in the United States. That actually allowed industry and business to grow without having to be adhering to different regulations that they've been having to adhere to under the Obama administration. The administration actually eliminated 22 regulations for every new regulatory action. The administration saved $8.1 billion net regulatory cost savings, equal over a 10-year period, equal to $570 million per year. Throughout 2017, President Trump made good on his promise to cut red tape, and in doing so, he re-energized United States agriculture, energy, and infrastructure sectors by freezing the rules that had been putting them under pressure. In the United States, President Trump is also working very closely and supporting our law enforcement. As we have seen on a global level, there has been many disturbances in the United States having to do with crime and having to do with actions by police that we can all say that we don't approve of. But there has been destruction in major cities, and there is a question in the United States right now about supporting law and justice or not supporting law and justice. There's a deeper conversation to that, but I'm trying to sum it up in a shorter way for all of you. He has announced $98 million in grant services to help orient policing, hiring programs to allow 820 full-time new employment officers. President Trump signed an executive order to restore state and local law enforcement access to surplus equipment from the Defense Department, such as armored vehicles. He expanded the project called Safe Neighborhoods to encourage U.S. attorneys to work with communities to develop customized crime reduction strategies. The Justice Department returned to their longstanding charging policy for federal prosecutors, which means we can trust them again to charge the most seriously serious offenses rather than the lighter offenses which had been done under the Obama administration. One of President Trump's most biggest promises during the 2016 election had to do with immigration. And we can all agree or disagree on how immigration should be done, but he made a promise to the American people that he was going to build a wall along the southern border and he was going to change the immigration into the United States. He has built a large section of the wall in the United States funded by the Congress and will continue to build that, and has cut down on illegal immigration into the United States. He negotiated a deal with Mexico so that when immigrants are coming up from Latin America, instead of residing in the United States when they apply for asylum, they stay in Mexico with support of the Mexican government while they wait for their trials to enter into the United States. You here in Singapore have a very protective border, the same way that every country does in the world. And everybody wants to protect their border. President Trump made a promise to the American people that he would protect the border. Promises made and promises kept. On health care, while we do not have the health care finished in the United States, President Trump made a promise to the American people that he would remove what we would call the individual mandate on health care in America. which basically required every American to pay into a system, whether they were healthy or not, so that the healthcare program could survive. It was determined that that additional requirement is an impediment of our freedom and was pulled out of pulled out of the healthcare bill. So promises made, promises kept. I could go on and on and on, having to do with the promises made and promises kept on behalf of President Trump. I've given you a very light overview of what Americans feel, why they support the president, because he has done what he said he would do, and Republicans and many independents in the United States believe in what the president believes, has done for the United States, and will continue to support him because he has done what he said he would do. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you for keeping within the time limit. I would now like to introduce our second speaker, who will speak for Vice President Biden. The speaker is Mr. Pong Kwan, a brilliant young lawyer from the United States. He graduated summa cum laude from UC Irvine and a JD from UC Berkeley. He has practiced corporate law with a major law firm in New York, another major law firm in China. And 2.5 years ago, he came to work for a multinational technology company in Singapore. Pong Kwan.
Hello. Okay. I would first like to thank you, Professor Ko, for inviting me and my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, here today. It is a privilege to be permitted to present our case to the American people before as such a distinguished and accomplished public servant as yourself. And albeit mostly virtually, some of Singapore's best and brightest as well. So where I'd like to start today is with values. And I was born 100% born and raised American, but like most of you, I have roots here in this region, including family from Singapore. And I also consider myself to be Southeast Asian. So as someone who straddles both sides of the world, the thing that strikes me the most is actually how much Singapore and the US actually have in common. And we're both former colonies that achieved independence from Britain, young democracies in the making of our stories still being written. We're both countries built by immigrants, with most of our peoples tracing their roots to somewhere else, and our societies are multiracial and multicultural. And as you said recently, Professor Ko, we celebrate our diversity as a blessing and not as a defect. We believe in justice and equality, and that we have an obligation to care for our most vulnerable and marginalized, that everyone, no matter who they are or where they are from, have a fair chance to prosper and succeed. And we believe in solidarity and sacrifice for the greater good, both to build progress towards a better future and to survive through times of adversity. So these are the American values that I believe in and that I believe we share with you. And if, like me, you believe in them, then you already know that this presidency is a repudiation of every single one of them, and that above all else, they are what are at stake in this election. So please, I ask that you keep these in mind as we present our case to you. I first want to say just very briefly that my colleague Tina will talk more about the very important issues of international relations and climate change, but I want to emphasize that the choice we face here is between an America that's engaged and working together with the world versus one that's isolationist and unilateral. And on climate change, unlike our Republican colleagues, we understand that this is an existential threat that requires immediate, united action by the world to stop. And we're here for that with Vice President Biden's comprehensive climate plan. So the first thing I want to talk about is the president's coronavirus response, or rather his lack of one. The very first responsibility of any president, any government, is to protect its people, to protect us. And he has failed completely at that. Now, if you listen to him on TV, he's made a spectacular attempt to gaslight you into thinking that somehow his response was effective. But all you have to do is to see through the smoke and mirrors, just take a step back and look at how many people have died. 225,000 Americans dead. The highest absolute number in the world and one of the highest per capita. And we've seen what an effective response looks like from places as varied as New Zealand, Germany, South Korea, Vietnam, and of course, right here in Singapore. It means first and foremost, listening to our scientists and public health experts, mobilizing to have sufficient testing, contact tracing, PPEs, and medical supplies, having an effective lockdown, with careful reopenings guided by science. It means not politicizing the simple acts of wearing a mask, and really just having any sort of coordinated national response plan at all. So the president has failed to do any of this, and you've seen the results. Hospitals over capacity, patients sharing ventilators, nurses and doctors forced to reuse masks and gowns and dying. A second wave of infections, a super spreader event at the White House infecting 34 people, including the president. And just this last weekend, another outbreak in the White House and the vice president's office. And now a third wave with infection rates of over 84,000 a day because we never shut down properly in the first place. 225,000 people dead. And it didn't have to be this way. Colombia's National Center for Disease Preparedness just released a report estimating as many as 210,000 of our deaths could have been avoided if we had just had a better federal response. And we actually had a special pandemic response team and an early detection program partnering with 60 labs, including the lab in Wuhan that identified COVID under the Obama administration, which President Trump eliminated in 2019. And he received reports as early as January and is on tape with Bob Woodward saying he knew how dangerous COVID is, but did almost nothing because he didn't want to panic people. Let me translate that for you. He panicked because he was worried about how the response would impact the stock market and affect his re-election. Now, 8 months later, he still has no plan except repeatedly calling the virus a Chinese flu or plague to distract from his own failures and contributing to the spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans like myself. President Trump's most important job was to bring the American people together to take this threat seriously and beat it, and he failed at that because he chose politics over our lives, and that alone is disqualifying. Now, my colleague mentioned his promises about healthcare, and I think this is a good place to highlight what's at the stakes with regards to healthcare generally. Because right now, as she mentioned, in the middle of a pandemic, this administration is fighting in court to repeal Obamacare. Now, one of the shared values I mentioned earlier is an obligation to care for the most vulnerable in our society. Now, the US, unlike every other developed country in the world, does not yet provide universal health care to its citizens. And if you're American, it is very possible that you will die if you are too poor to afford health insurance. And in fact, that was the premise of a very popular TV show in America, where the main character was the teacher who made and sold drugs in order to afford cancer treatments. Now, can you imagine that happening in any other developed country? Can you imagine right here in Singapore, a public school teacher forced to sell drugs because he or she can't afford their cancer treatments? No, because you have MediShield here. Because like every other developed country in the world, you believe that healthcare is a right and not a privilege reserved for the rich. And that is what we believe, and why President Biden will create a public option for health insurance, expand Obamacare to ensure that every American will have access to affordable healthcare. Now, yes, this will cost some money, but every other developed country has been able to do it and found that the benefits and health outcomes outweigh the costs. So the question here is simple. Do you believe that we have an obligation to use our resources to provide healthcare for our most vulnerable? Every other developed nation has already said yes. Now, I think what these last two topics have really highlighted are the president's values. He will always prioritize money over lives and capital over people. And you can see that how much he and my Republican colleague emphasizes his economic achievements over everything else. So let's talk about his economic record for just a minute. First of all, let me state the obvious. The economy is in worse shape now than when he took office. GDP growth is negative, unemployment has doubled, and we are in a recession. Now, I know he disclaims, and they disclaim responsibility for this like everything, but that's not how it works. It's happened under his watch. This economy is as bad as it is largely due to his failed coronavirus response. But okay, fine, let's talk about the pre-pandemic economy. The fact is President Trump inherited a booming economy from the last administration, and you can draw a straight line from that economy to this one. GDP growth was around 2.4, 2.5% under both presidents. About 224,000 jobs a month were added under Obama versus 183,000 under Trump. The S&P 500 grew 85% in Obama's first term, 53% under his second, compared to 47% under Trump. So just looking at the statistics, economic performance was actually about the same or even worse under President Trump. Now, let's look at what President Trump did do, which my Republican colleague brought up, when he had this strong economy, which was pass one of the largest corporate tax giveaways in history. The 2017 tax cuts, which gave the vast majority of its benefits to corporations and the rich, 3/4 of which went to the wealthiest 10% alone. A household making above $1 million on average saved about $70,000. a middle-class household making between $50,000 to $70,000 saved $870. Like that's not even enough to pay for a COVID test in most of the US. And it's estimated that his tax cut could cost up to $2.7 trillion in lost revenue. That's money that could have been invested back into our country, fixing our infrastructure, improving our schools, helping the poor. You could have paid for all of our climate and healthcare plans. And remember, this is not even improved economic performance at all. President Trump inherited the booming economy at a time when corporations were making record profits and wealth inequality was approaching levels not seen since the 1920s. And he decided that the best thing he could do was give these people, the wealthiest in our society, even more money. So when you hear Republicans say that Democrats can't afford to pay for our plans, just remember that 2.7 trillion number and know that they are lying and that they have already taken that money and giving it to corporations and the rich. So again, what this ultimately comes down to is a choice of values. Do you believe that we as a society should use our resources to help the vulnerable, protect the environment, build our country, and invest in our future? Or do we choose to maximize corporate interests and further enrich the wealthiest and our most privileged? Now, I'd like to turn to the protests in America right now. And these are some of the most urgent calls for racial justice in a generation. And the president wants people to be afraid of them. But I want to emphasize that the research has shown that 95% of all the protests have been peaceful. And if you're watching from America right now, if you're in my hometown of Santa Ana, where peaceful Black Lives Matter protests happen, I ask that you take a look out your window and tell me if what you see matches the alternate world of anarchy that the president has been describing. I think the majority of you will say no. Now, despite all of this, yes, there were some protests that were violent, resulted in violence. Vice President Biden has condemned this. But I think if we want to start healing our country, which is what the next president needs to do, and this president has not been doing, is try to understand why these protests are happening in the first place, and why some people are so angry that a small fraction have resulted in violence. And the fact is, it's because Black Americans are still being murdered by the police on our streets at a rate of up to 6 times more than white people. And none of us here knows what that's like. To live our lives afraid that every police interaction might be our last, to raise our children by giving them a talk, to prepare them for this happening to them. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, countless other unarmed Black Americans killed by our police. Imagine this was your family member who was murdered, and there's no accountability because the police will never admit wrongdoing, even lie about what happened unless there's video footage. And because of qualified immunity, even if they are charged, they'll still probably get away a bit. This is just one issue. Black Americans have been enslaved, segregated, and systematically marginalized and discriminated against in America for hundreds of years. They've only very recently begun to be treated equally under the law. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Fair Housing Act in 1968. This is less time than Singapore has been independent. This is less time than most of Southeast Asia has been decolonized. And just as Southeast Asia continues to grapple with the legacy of colonialism today, so too do we in America struggle with systemic racism against all racial minorities, but especially Black Americans. Black people are in prison at a rate of 6 times more than white people, and studies have shown that it's not because they commit more crimes, because they are treated more harshly at every single level of our criminal justice system. They are more likely to be stopped by the police, be charged with a higher offense, and given a longer sentence for the same infractions. They actually use drugs at a lower rate than white people, but are in prison nearly 3 times more for it. And the problem extends to so many other facets of society, from school discipline to equal pay, and we don't have time to discuss that here, but this is once again a question of values. When faced with the oppression of a marginalized people in our society, what do? We've seen what this president does, largely ignore it, eliminate federal anti-bias training, and fail to implement any real criminal justice reform. And in fact, as my colleague pointed out, it's expanding the police state, giving more resources for the police to come in and charge people with harsh crimes. And most importantly, fuel division and hate, openly disparaging protesters or encouraging right-wing militias and white supremacists, insulting minorities, calling Hispanic and Muslim immigrants and refugees terrible, terrible things, rapists and murderers and terrorists. He is only dividing the country more. Vice President Biden, meanwhile, has a comprehensive plan to use federal funding to push states to reduce incarceration and enact police reform, create checks on prosecutorial misconduct, eliminate mandatory minimums, provide funding for social services, and discourage the incarceration of children. Equally important, he acknowledges the reality of systemic racism and is ready to unite us as a nation to address it. So the choices are clear. And the question is, do we really believe in achieving an equal, multiracial, multicultural society, protecting the marginalized and oppressed? And are we going to take care of our own, even when they don't look like us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to turn to our third speaker, who will speak on behalf of Vice President Mike Pence. Jeff Payne has lived in Singapore for over 20 years. And during that time, he worked for some of the biggest and most reputable corporations of the world. 4 years ago, he started his own company, and he gives strategic advice to corporates in the region on government relations. Jeff, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you, Ambassador Ko, Tembusu Forum, students and professors. Welcome to our colleagues from the Democrats. Thank you for hosting us here at this beautiful campus. Similar to the president, I would like to focus on really the results. I think that a lot of the results that this administration has achieved are not really getting enough attention, and they do have impact on people's lives. So like the president, I want to focus on promises made, promises kept, and focus on the results. And I think that this president has been able to, the president and his administration has been able to achieve more in 47 months than Joe Biden has achieved in his 47 years in government. What Donald J. Trump has done is expose the all talk, no action type of political actors. And his administration has done this by creating results for the American people. Promises made, promises kept. What you'll see is an administration that has achieved a significant number of achievements in a short time, and we will continue to do this in our second term. During my time here today, I will cover several topics which have been ranked as important to the American people for this election. The first topic I'd like to talk about is the coronavirus response and actions. This is a virus pandemic which has hit the world with no real expectations. But it doesn't mean that the president has done nothing. In January of 2020, the coronavirus task force was created. On the 31st of January, Trump closed travel from China. At that time, Vice President Biden criticized the move, saying it was xenophobic. Many health officials later have then said that this is actually something that saved lives. On March 13th, the president declared a national emergency. On the 27th, the president signed into law a $2.2 trillion emergency spending bill, providing support to those who had lost their jobs and also who had been afflicted by this pandemic. He helped states that were in need. Earlier on in the pandemic, states like New York were in deep trouble. He, within a matter of weeks, had assembled the USNS Comfort and had that delivered to New York to provide excess hospital capacity to take hospital patients who in an overcrowded New York system. He did the same thing in San Diego, providing the USMS Mercy and docked that in San Diego. The boat in New York was not actually needed, so it was sent back, but this president has been doing things at very quick speeds. He used the Defense Production Act to produce PPE and ventilators to ensure that Americans had their needs met. The program was so successful that they had excess ventilators and were able to help other countries and different parts of the country. He established Operation Warp Speed to develop over 300 million doses of a safe and effective vaccine. And one of the things that the Democrats love to say is that he's not following the science, he's not following the science. Well, he's creating an environment that enables programs like Operation Warp Speed, the environment to create vaccines at a record pace. He followed the science and created that environment for science to succeed. This pandemic has hit many countries, so when Vice President Biden mentions the unemployment and the loss of jobs and things like that, I think this is something that every country around the world is grappling with. America is not alone. The next topic I'd like to talk a bit about is global trade. Through the America First agenda, Donald J. Trump had intensified his focus on making global trade work for the American citizens through reworking multilateral deals and initiating many bilateral discussions. I'll name a few. He replaced the failing NAFTA deal with the USMCA, a deal that Senator Harris was one of only 10 senators who did not vote and support this deal. He stopped France's digital tax scheme in late December 2019, which would have a significant negative impact on global tech giants. Many of them are American. He renegotiated a weak US-Korea free trade agreement in 2017, resulting in a new free trade agreement in 2019, his first successful trade deal. In January 2020, negotiations with China saw an agreement where China would substantially increase agricultural farm good purchases from American farmers. Working with Australia on issues of refugees and digital trade, he's enhanced that relationship. The US-Japan trade deal came into force in January of this year. He's making trade work for American citizens. Vice President Biden has also spoken on race relations. Donald J. Trump has done more for African American and brown communities than most leaders in America. With the historically black colleges and universities, Donald Trump moved that program from the Department of Education to the White House, showing it is a top priority. This is something that the HBCUs had requested year after year after year under 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration. Donald Trump did it in 45 days into his first term. He increased budgets for programs, projects, and policies to support HBCUs. He also introduced the First Step Act of 2018. This is enacting a historic reforms to make the justice system fairer for all. He ended the 3 strikes life sentencing. He had provision for other offenses that gave judges more discretion on nonviolent crimes, including narcotics. He was developing programs to promote rehabilitation rather than incarceration. This is in contrast to Joe Biden's 1994 crime law that he authored that contributed to mass incarceration problems in the US, overly impacting African American and minority communities. They said it led to more prison sentences, more prison cells, more aggressive policing, especially hurting Black and brown Americans who are disproportionately likely to be incarcerated. Next, I want to talk about national security. This is somewhere where Donald Trump has made great progress. President Trump has made the world a safer place to be by ending the endless wars and eliminating global terror leaders who endanger our national security. By Christmas this year, the American soldiers should be remaining troops from Afghanistan should be back home. This is a war that started almost 20 years ago. In 2002, Joe Biden was the senator who voted for the war in Iraq. Donald Trump opposed this. The war in Iraq was a major foreign policy blunder. The Trump administration decapitated ISIS. He stopped ISIS from reigning terror in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. In October of 2019, the military eliminated their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I want to talk a bit about peace because peace is important for national security. Middle East peace. The Trump administration has done more for peace in the Middle East than anybody else in decades. The Trump administration has laid out a comprehensive 2-state peace plan for Palestinians and Israelis, something many past presidents have talked about but rarely acted upon. President Donald J. Trump moved the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton promised before getting elected and failed to do anything about after being elected. Promises made, promises kept. This move, like many, represented a promise made and a promise kept for the US strongest ally in the Middle East and was popular with the evangelical and conservative voters who elected the president. Just this year alone, the president and this administration had brokered peace deals with Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Israel and Bahrain in September, and Israel and Sudan just last week. I want to talk a bit about NATO. NATO political and military alliance was formed in 1949. Since taking office, Donald J. Trump has increased the pressure on NATO members to live up to their commitment to spend 2% of their GDP on defense expenditure to contribute to international security. As an example, in 2017, the US spent more than 3.6% of GDP above the commitment, while many NATO states failed to meet the 2% threshold. Last year, the US spent less on NATO and has encouraged several other members to increase to the same, and in some cases, exceed the 2%. In the Indo-Pacific area, the Trump administration has developed a military and political alliance with Australia, Japan, and India, effectively forming the Quad to counter China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. I want to talk a bit about the economy. There's been no better president than Donald J. Trump on the economy. As the president mentioned, he enacted the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. This led US companies to repatriate more than $1 trillion of offshore money to put the money to work in America. As was previously mentioned, the rate was 35%, and it dropped to a one-time 15.5% tax rate after the law was passed. Taxes on individuals and corporations were lowered. Under the Trump tax cuts, the amount was a flat 21%. Okay, thank you.
I thank Jeff for his statement. The fourth speaker this evening will speak for Senator Harris, and the speaker is Tina Forbush. Tina is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School. She has done many things in her life, including being a Justice Clerk at the Supreme Court of Hawaii, taught in high schools on the mainland. She's currently in Singapore with the Singapore American School as a counselor. Very happy to have you this evening. Tina, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Ko, for having us here today. And thanks to all of the NUS students who are bravely spending an evening taking an interest in an election that's happening half a world away. Unfortunately, we're not just talking about an election here. We're talking about a fundamental crisis of leadership and the future of democracy. The current administration is unpredictable, unstable, and divisive. As Senator Harris herself has said, this president isn't trying to make America great. He's trying to make America hate, and that has to stop. We need to return to our country's moral center, which is one of character, compassion, integrity, and human decency. And 4 years ago, my worthy opponent here, Tina Data, representing then candidate Trump, actually said he's a loose cannon and makes comments that he shouldn't make. Well, being a loose cannon as a leader is not appropriate, and it's dangerous. That is a failure of leadership, and that has to stop. My colleague Fong has already touched on a number of reasons that that has to stop, and now I will be addressing the areas of climate change, foreign policy, election equity, and values. Humans have a moral obligation to deal with climate change. You know this, we're the ones who've caused it, and now it is the #1 issue facing humanity. The timeline on this is urgent, and the scope is worldwide. So what has the president done? Well, he's withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords. That's an agreement that 197 nations, including Singapore, have signed. He has worked to roll back and reverse more than 70 major environmental regulations, and he's working on another 30. He's ended tax credits for solar and electric car companies, while at the same time allowing American and other car companies to make cars that are more highly polluting and less fuel efficient. And he's allowed private drilling and mining exploration in public lands, protected lands, beautiful lands in states like Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, the coastlines of Texas and Louisiana. And he's trying to do the same thing in the Arctic. This list could go on for hours. And unfortunately, I have a time limit and I might wear out my voice. So here's the summary. Donald Trump has said that global warming was caused by and for the Chinese, and that climate change is a hoax that is being perpetrated by scientists who are having a lot of fun. But those scientists are not having fun. They're working tirelessly to inform us, to protect us. We need them. The world is getting hotter. Glaciers are melting. Tides are rising. Floods are increasing. There are incredibly dangerous fires burning as I speak in the Western United States, specifically today in California. But President Trump has said that science doesn't know what's causing these forest fires. And that's just not true. Scientists do know what's causing all of these things. Denying science is not rational. So there's a reason that Scientific American, a premier nonpartisan research journal, has for the first time in its 175-year history endorsed a presidential candidate. And that presidential candidate is Joe Biden. Because we promise science, not fiction. Now, changing the catastrophic course of the environment will require massive investment and mobilization, both domestically and internationally, and the Democrats are committed to making this happen. We will achieve carbon neutrality in our country by 2035 and net zero emissions by 2050. We will transition from oil and coal to renewable energy. We will create an environmental justice advisory council, which we so badly need, and we will establish a national climate change research agency. Here's the thing, we have a plan, they don't. We will join the Paris Climate Accords, we will join Singapore. We will host a global climate summit within our first 100 days in office. We will lead an effort for every major country to have transparent, enforceable, better climate targets. This has to be a global effort. We have to work together for the future of our planet. Now, when Joe Biden is elected, one of the first things he's pledged to do is get on the phone to world leaders and say, America is back, you can count on us. Integrity and decency will be keystones of our foreign policy. America's international standing has been badly tarnished over the past 4 years. Ask any Singapore cab driver. A recent study shows that the reputation of the US around the world dropped 13% last year alone. Why? Well, the president has antagonized our allies in NATO, Japan, South Korea. He's abandoned President Obama's pivot to Asia, and he's withdrawn from all sorts of things, the TPP, the Paris Climate Accords, the Iran deal, and the World Health Organization in the midst of a world health pandemic. And don't let them fool you. We still have troops in Afghanistan. We haven't decapitated ISIS, we decapitated a man, and that was the US military that did that. While cozying up to North Korea sometimes, North Korea has also tested its largest ICBM in recent history, and China is still in the South China Sea. And we have a president who tosses out insults like candy. He has spewed anti-Islamic rhetoric. He has referred to El Salvador, Haiti, African countries as a word I can't say on camera, but it starts with S and it ends with hole. He has called Mexicans rapists, the country of Turkey a total disgrace, Germany a total mess, the UN so sad. President Trump has been nothing short of offensive. The world doesn't need insults. Today more than ever, we need to work with other leaderships. We need relationships. Lives all over the world are interconnected. We should look for ways to enhance those opportunities, work with what they afford. The Democrats will respect US allies and also create new valued relationships. We will rejoin the WHO. We will lift this administration's Muslim ban. We will take in more refugees who so badly need our help. And we will try to act as a force of compassion and hope in the world, especially in these trying times. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say that the foundations of democracy are at stake in this election. A stable democracy relies on the peaceful transfer of power from one person or party to the next. But when asked in September whether he would have a peaceful transfer of power if he were to lose this election, Donald Trump said, well, we'll have to see what happens. The Republicans are doing all that they can to prevent a more diverse, more impoverished, younger voting base in the US from voting. When House Democrats proposed vote-by-mail options and expanded early voting to make it safer to vote during COVID, Republicans knocked it down. Republicans have consistently pushed policies that would disenfranchise people, from voter identification laws to shutting down poll locations in low-income and minority neighborhoods. This is not just an election based on issues, it's an election based on values. We need to treat people with dignity, making sure everyone has a chance. So let's look at President Trump's values. Let's look at immigration. where President Trump's xenophobia has kept out Muslims, reduced avenues for freedom for refugees, separated children from their families, and tried to build a wall. He's only built 7 new miles along a 2,000-mile border. Let's look at rape culture, where multiple women have accused the president of sexual assault, and he himself has bragged about his ability to assault women with abandon. Let's look at the courts, where of the 50 judges President Trump appointed to the US Court of Appeals, 50 judges, lifetime appeals or lifetime appointments, zero were Black. Let's look at gun violence, where President Trump has done nothing to ban assault rifles, the weapons most used in mass shootings in the US, or close the loophole that allows anyone to purchase a gun from a private individual with no background check at all. Oh, let's look at who pays taxes. Donald Trump paid $750 in taxes 2 years in a row. I, a high school educator, paid thousands of dollars more. And let's look at a person's right to earn a living wage. Over 38 million Americans live below the poverty level, and the president has kept the minimum wage at a paltry $7.25 an hour. What good is it to bring washing machines to the United States if you can't put food on your table? And he has ignored historically Black colleges until Congress put a bill before him conveniently just before an election where he needed to have a win on race. Our country is at an inflection point. It is in chaos with values split between one party, the Democrats, who stand for equity, compassion, and dignity, and another party, the Republicans, who seem to have lost their moral compass. But this divisiveness has to stop. We need to look beyond these divisions. Unity is our strength. Diversity is our power. We need to return to being a country where we look out for one another, where we rise and fall as one, where we face our challenges and celebrate our triumphs together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. We now heard 4 very eloquent statements, and it's time for us to proceed to the Q&A segment. So I'd like to invite Jordan to put your first question to President Trump.
My question is directed at President Trump. Systemic racism became the main issue front and center when the riots exploded in response to the initial killing of George Floyd, and more recently, your refusal to condemn white supremacy. Does the Trump administration have a coherent solution to what appears to be vocal dissatisfaction with racial injustice in America?
Tina, please.
Thank you for your question. The first thing I would like to say is that unfortunately here in Asia, what all of you see on television is what's brought to you on behalf of CNN in the United States and also BBC from Europe. While we can all agree the way that George Floyd was killed by the police officer, what's important for you to know is that George Floyd didn't just walk over and get arrested and put on the ground. In no way are we making any excuses for anything that happened on behalf of those police officers. But we have a problem in the United States across the board, across cultures, having to do with authority. And in the United States, when a police officer says to you to stop, a police officer says to you to put your hands on your dashboard, no matter what your skin color is, you are to follow the instructions. Something that I think just personally I'd like to let you know. I'm married to an Indian man. I have 4 children. They're all brown-skinned children. I have 2 boys that are 27 years old that are of brown skin in the United States. And I understand when these conversations take place and the discussions that I have to have with them about following procedures and instructions while engaging with officers or police in the United States. I wanted you to understand that. I do understand what you're saying to me. I have 34 seconds left. Sorry about that. What was the second part of your question?
The second part is just, does the Trump administration have a coherent...
How many times? Okay, so again, talking points that you're hearing on the news. President Trump has has said multiple times from the beginning of 2016 to 2017 to 2018 to 2019, and you can look this up and Google it yourself, he stands strongly against white supremacy. He stands strongly against white rights, angry white rights in the United States. White supremacy he has spoken against time and time and time again. And the information that you're receiving on behalf of the news here in Asia or on behalf of the massive propaganda that you heard from my Democratic colleagues over here, you need to be really serious here in Asia to look in for your own news. The talking points that you just heard from them are talking points that you hear on CNN in the United States, but those are not, just because they're heard doesn't mean they're facts. I would request all of you to go and do your own research. Yes, things are not good in the United States, but they are not like as they have discussed them. I'm actually so surprised by what they have said. It's all propaganda. It's not facts.
Actually, Singaporeans not only watch CNN and BBC, they also watch Fox. So Fox
I'm talking
is
about the college students here, and I'm quite sure they're busy
Yeah.
just catching up on their local news.
So I want to ask Edward. Edward, would you put your first question to Vice President Biden?
Thank you. Vice President Biden, inequality is perhaps the defining issue of our time. For instance, the economy during the pandemic sees stock markets reaching record highs while unemployment claims have soared. Do you agree that corporate influence in American politics is one cause of this inequality? And if so, what do you propose to do about it?
Testing. Yes, absolutely. So as I said in my opening statement, inequality and corporate interests is certainly something that is its effect on our economy is very, very deep. And you can see that right now, inequality is at its highest state since the 1920s. So today, the top 10% in America, the wealthiest, hold about 77% of all the wealth. Corporations, my Republican colleagues keep bringing up all these ideas of tax cuts that we're going to give corporations tax cuts and somehow this will trickle down and help everybody else. So in 2016, corporate cash reserves is at $1.9 trillion. After the tax cuts, after everything we did, all the corporate welfare, government completely controlled by the Republican administration, trying to help these corporations out, what happened? Corporate cash reserves today, in the middle of a pandemic, are at $4 trillion. So they've taken that money, that was supposedly was to be used to help the people, and just kept it. They sat on it, did nothing of it. So what Vice President Biden has proposed is to, first of all, undo these tax cuts, right? Restore the way things were before. Make sure these corporations and the wealthy do their part, fulfill their obligations to society, and pay taxes and contribute to the world that they are benefiting from. Because, they bring up a lot about all these high tax rates and such. America is the #1 economy in the world. Our corporations are the richest in the world. They're sitting on so much money. So you just look at the facts. They're not suffering because of this. In fact, they're benefiting, they're exploiting the system, and they've been making things worse. And so I think that's where we need to start, to stop giving handouts and corporate welfare to all these corporations and equalize the playing field for regular people like the rest of us.
I'd like to ask Daryl to put your first question to Vice President Pence.
Thank you. This question is addressed to Vice President Pence candidate. With a clear conservative majority confirmed in the Supreme Court as of today, and with Trump's track record of appointing conservative justices to federal boards, pro-life and religious freedom agendas are expected to receive strong institutional support in the coming years. Is there still a place for separation of church and state in American governance in the light of the potential conflict of interest this provides? Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for that question. And you're right. I think when I look at the debate from 2016, Steve Okun, who was here representing Hillary Rodham Clinton, actually said that the Supreme Court was important. And when Donald Trump ran as a candidate Trump in 2016, he produced a list. This is a list of people he would be putting as potential nominations to the Supreme Court should the opportunity arise. As Tina had pointed out today, we just had another confirmation today with Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch in 2017, and Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. I've heard our colleagues talk about values and culture. And this is where I think that President Trump is right when he says, all talk, no action. It sounded like they were reading off their website from Biden 2020. I do think that it's important to realize the reason why Donald Trump is popular, the reason why he travels across the country and has massive turnout from people is because what he said he would do, he has done more than any other president in modern history. So that was what he was elected for. Now, one thing I think that the Democrats have been really, when you talk about values, how many Democrats from the Senate Judiciary Committee attended the vote to put Amy Coney Barrett to the full Senate floor? 0. That's the answer. So the vote was 12-0. So that's showing the values, that they don't have the respect. They also have to look at the, under President Obama, he put together 2 Supreme Court nominations. If you look at how those passed the Senate with bipartisan support, that did not happen. Amy Coney Barrett, 0 Democrats, -1 Republican. Brett Kavanaugh, 3 Democrats who had to vote due to political reasons. So I think when you think about values, when you look deep down, what's really happening there, the Democrats show when they don't get their way, they actually throw their prams out of the toys out of the pram. Thank you.
I don't think you've answered Darrell's question. Darrell's question, Darrell's question is whether you continue to support the constitutional separation of church and state in the United States. That's the question.
Yeah, I think that that will be continuing. And I do think that the talk about, overturning Obamacare and a woman's right to abortion immediately eliminated with Amy Coney Barrett being put up to the Supreme Court, I think it's fear mongering. And I just think a lot of the dialogue that was held by many of the senators calling this a sham and shouldn't have happened, this has happened 29 times in American history. And when the president and the Senate are held by the same party, 17 or 19 they were confirmed in the year of an election. When the president was different from the head of the Senate, only 2 out of 10 times. So this is a precedent. I think they're using a lot of, basically churning up that it's a hoax and it shouldn't have happened. I hope that answers your question.
Rahul, your turn to ask a question to Senator Harris.
Thank you for the speech earlier. My question will be on Medicare for All. I was wondering, because you were an early proponent for Medicare for All, and Joe Biden is not. So why have you abandoned true Medicare for All in favor of a ticket which supports merely reforming or expanding the ACA? Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. So it's a great question. It involves, unfortunately, a rather deep understanding of American healthcare policy, and I'm not sure that I have time to go into all of the details right now. Suffice it to say that I've had a lot of thinking, that Kamala Harris has had, Senator Harris has had a great deal of thinking to do about this question of where her position is on how healthcare should be provided to the American people, right? As my colleague said earlier, Americans we're not guaranteed prior to President Obama's turn any right to healthcare at all, and under what is now colloquially known as Obamacare, people have the right to a federally protected, at the moment, right to healthcare, though that is, President Trump is working at eating away at that as quickly as he can. The question now is, going forward, what's going to happen and where are people going to get their health care? And should everyone be under a state system, or should some people also be able to buy private insurance as well, right? That's sort of what your question is getting at. Yep. So this is the issue here, is what Senator Harris's position is on whether people should be getting everything from the state or whether people should be getting some of their health care, have the option of getting it privately. Essentially what we're looking at is when you join a presidential ticket, you have to make agreements, and Joe Biden has a plan that I think is amazing. So Vice President Biden has laid out a plan that expands Medicare availability for those who want it, but also allows people to purchase from the private system, but also has other things that I think are really going to help with healthcare in terms of how you deal with trusts, how you deal with prescription drugs. So I think that there are a lot of things that I think that Joe has come up with that are really awesome, and that I'm very pleased that Senator Harris is supporting.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Jordan to put a second question to President Trump, please.
Okay, so my second question for President Trump is, with the unmistakably fast pace of the confirmation of the latest Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, what are the possible blowbacks of such a move? Is your administration and party prepared to handle such consequences?
Thank you for that question. Just so that we're aware, if and when President Trump wins his second reelection, the blowback that you're talking about won't be taking place. But let's go under the assumption that we don't know who's going to win the election yet, and I will be happy to answer that question. From what I understand, Vice President Biden currently is stating that he is not going to look at stacking the court, which is changing the number of Supreme Court justices on the court. What he has basically said is that he would pull in scholars from all over, from Republicans, Democrats, and otherwise, to come together to talk about a different type of Supreme Court administration. And we don't know exactly what that means, but he's not probably going to be as punitive as all this noise is being stated on behalf of the Senate, because the bottom line is, in order to do what the Senate says they want to do, it's going to take a 10-year time period for them to actually put those processes in place to make those changes. So that's all noise. Again, it's noise that you're listening to. It's intimidating noise, but it's noise. Well, I have 51 seconds. I want to go back to your question to give you a broader answer on what your question is. If you were able to watch Amy Coney Barrett's acceptance speech tonight when she was nominated, I think you'll find your true answers having to do with her and her perspective on being placed on the highest court in the land. Republicans do not want justices or judges in the United States having their own personal opinions weigh in on what the law says. Those are called constitutional laws that we want our judges to have. We don't want their personal opinions to weigh in on a position. She made it very clear that she takes this nomination, she takes her appointment to the court to the highest level of respect that she can have, and that she will never take her personal views, whether they be conservative, Catholic, pro-life, or otherwise, into a judgment call having to do with the law. We all can't sit here now at this point, now that she's a judge, and be cynical about that. I want to take her at her word, as I take Democrat politicians at their word when they say things. We want our Supreme Court to follow the law. And one of the things that's really important is you guys understand the Supreme Court doesn't make laws. They enforce, or they say they're not accurate based on the Constitution when things are brought to them, but the legislature in the United States makes laws. So not the Supreme Court. They are only supposed to follow the Constitution and what the Constitution says regarding the laws on the books as we now have them. Does that better answer your question? Okay.
As a friend of the United States, I want to say to both parties that the United States Supreme Court is a very precious national institution. And I appeal to the leaders of the two parties to think long-term and not short-term. And they must refrain from politicizing the US Supreme Court. Edward, can you put the second question to Vice President Biden, please?
Thank you. This second question shall explore more on the foreign policy of Vice President Biden. Vice President Biden has expressed interest in stronger action to combat what he believes to be increasingly aggressive Chinese diplomatic activity in the Asia-Pacific region. Is a stronger US presence in the region feasible in the long run? And how do you believe each administration will attempt to reach a modus vivendi with China?
Yes, I certainly think it's feasible. And one thing I will give to the Trump administration is that they have put a lot of focus on China relations recently. I would say that was a continuation of what happened under Obama when we had to pivot to Asia and negotiating TPP, which was in large part an attempt to sort of increase U.S. influence and counter the rise of China. So this is something that both parties have been thinking about for a long time, and it's something that we need to do. China is going to be a big part of the world. There's no getting around that. They will at some point even probably overtake the U.S. Economy in size. So we have to engage with China. And I think what we've seen from the Trump administration and their actions is that, as my colleague pointed out, the U.S. is just basically going at it alone. We've antagonized our allies. We're destroying our alliances, just engaging this very unilateral trade war with China that doesn't, quite frankly, harms both countries. Manufacturing jobs in the U.S. are down 300,000. According to Moody's, we've lost 300,000 manufacturing jobs because of the trade war. And I think what Joe Biden wants to do is he wants to engage with the world, build up our alliances, get back into Asia, and engage with China collectively in a multilateral basis. And I think, that is what's needed. That's what's needed to be done.
Thank you. Daryl, can you put your second question to Vice President Pence?
Of course. My second question concerns a similar long-term trend. As international consensus has generally come to, there will be a widespread automation of jobs across and within industries in the coming decades. According to a December 2018 Pew survey, 8 in 10 adults, or 82% of survey correspondents, believe that by 2050, robots will do the majority of the work presently done by humans. The Trump administration has made domestic jobs a key policy plank. How does it propose to find long-term solutions to this seemingly inevitable trend? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think when I look at the NAFTA agreement, one of the challenges that the NAFTA agreement posed for America was that there was no retraining of jobs that were sent overseas. And if you look at the automotive industry, it's a perfect example. You could be a family of 4 living in Michigan, earning a very decent wage, working on one of the assembly lines. And when that job was shipped over to China or to Mexico, there was no retraining and retooling of that employee. So how do you take a person who could be making $100,000 a year with a decent job that can support a family and a household, and then taking that job, shipping it overseas and having no retraining programs? This is going to be increasingly important with things like AI, machine learning. Technology, we can't stop technology. We have to figure out how can you benefit from technology, grow your economy. That is definitely true here in Asia. Technology offers so much opportunities. The stocks that we're talking about doing very well in the pandemic are e-commerce stocks and technology stocks. We're doing distributed working, distributed learning, distributing healthcare. So technology's been a huge benefit for us in this pandemic. I mean, I work from home. My friends' kids go to school from home. So I think that that's something really important, that we have to embrace technology, but how do we take the workers who are displaced by trade agreements? This is where Donald Trump's done a great job. Replacing NAFTA with USMCA, I think is a great start. The reason why America wants to look at bilateral deals versus multilaterals is, one, they're a lot less complex, and two, it enables the president and the Trump administration to really leverage the power that America has. I know a lot of people were very sad when US pulled out of CPTPP, as it's known now, but keep in mind, Hillary Clinton also said it was not, she went from being a gold standard to, I don't want TPP when it came election time. So remember, people say things to get elected, but they don't always do what they're gonna say.
Rahul, your second question for Senator Harris, please.
Okay. I'll be asking a different question from the one I've had prepared, because I feel that you already addressed it. You already addressed it in your speech earlier. So please forgive me if it isn't a very good question. It goes like this. We saw that the Trump admin pulled out of the Paris Accord and the Iran nuclear deal without very much difficulty. How will the Biden administration ensure that the policies and partnerships that are formed last beyond the current administration or the administration to come?
Yeah. So the question here is, how will the Harris-Biden presidential, vice presidential unity essentially ensure that accords, agreements that we enter into extend beyond 8 years, which is what we'd love to see. Okay, thanks. Just wanted to make sure I had that. All right, so I think that the answer here is that to make something work and to keep something long-term, you have to create relationships with other countries. You have to create relationships with other world leaders and create accords that become so integral to who you are as a society and what you value culturally that no one would want to leave it. So it's all about trying to figure out where those places are, where a variety of countries can see eye to eye and work together and find a space that the country that's involved, no matter whether it's Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal, whatever you want, whatever title you want, that you find those roots into compromise. And I think you find that really through relationships. And I think that that's where the Trump administration has been so problematic, is really in not forming those kinds of relationships that can create ongoing commitments. I think also helping to repair a country, right? If a country is divided, you're going to get another administration where people say, well, I'm out, I'm not doing that, right? I'm throwing things away. You need to create a country that works together. And that's part of what we want to do is heal, not create hate, not create division, but find a position where the country actually feels like we're doing something as one. Then we're going to come to accords where we go forward with things. And Rahul, this isn't your question, but I need to say one thing. I feel very strongly about this. And this goes to a question that you raised about George Floyd. I understand that there may be people who resist authority in the United States, but nothing excuses kneeling on someone's neck for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. There is blood, black blood, being shed on the streets of the United States, and that has to change. I just really had to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. As we still have a little more time, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask each of you either 1 round or 2 rounds of questions. So I begin with President Trump. So my question to President Trump is this region, Southeast Asia, and our regional organization, ASEAN, important to your administration? And wait, if your answer is yes, why did you skip the last 2 ASEAN summit meetings? And did you know that last year, the ASEAN leaders felt very insulted that you didn't come, you didn't send Vice President Pence, you didn't send Secretary Pompeo, but you sent somebody who's not even a member of the cabinet? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you for the question. And what I would say is, yes, the United States does take the ASEAN nations very seriously and finds them very strong partners. And while what you did say having to do with President Trump not being able to attend the ASEAN meeting, I, as a Republican, I can agree with you that I was also disappointed that a higher administration official did not come here on his behalf. So there's no disputing that between yourself and myself. As you guys know, in the United States, over the past 3 years, President Trump has had to deal with many domestic problems having to do with impeachment, lawsuits, research by the Senate, the Congress, and other things. And I do believe during that time, there was an impeachment trial that was looking towards coming towards President Trump. And I think that there were more focuses on domestic issues at that time than there was in ASEAN. I'm glad you asked me this question because I had a few things I wanted to say about our relationship with ASEAN. You know, when the president did come to Asia, he did choose Singapore to hold one of his meetings with North Korea. He did take time to go to Vietnam and hold another meeting in Vietnam. He could have held those meetings anywhere. We have had multiple visits in the ASEAN region on behalf of our State Department, our Defense Secretary, and they are here frequently and often. And I do believe that as you read your newspapers, you know that. So while it doesn't appear, and yes, he did not attend the ASEAN meetings, the Navy has always visiting here in the Singapore port. The Navy is patrolling the South China Sea to help protect the ASEAN nations on behalf of China's encroachment into that area. They are patrolling those straits so that China doesn't take over those straits. They have worked with India to create an agreement together to protect the Sri Lankan straits. They're working in conjunction with Indonesia and Vietnam to create partnerships to patrol the South China Sea. I don't want to get into the politics because I try not to get into talking points, but the bottom line is those islands popped up under the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. So the Trump administration takes the security of ASEAN very seriously, and I think you and I as friends, we probably know that.
Thank you. My question for Vice President Biden. I think everybody agrees that the most important bilateral relationship in the world today is that between the United States and China. Vice President Biden has often criticized President Trump as having an incoherent China policy. So my question to you is, do you see the rise of China as a threat to American prosperity and security or not? How do you view China? Is China a friend or an adversary, a competitor or a partner? What would a Biden administration China policy be?
So I think, thank you, Professor Ko. I think a lot of that you can see was what happened under the Obama and Biden administration that obviously Biden served in. I think the relationship between China and the US is still to be determined. It's something in progress, right? China's growth is very recent in the last couple of decades. And the world is still grappling with that and figuring out how to handle it. So it's something that needs to be determined over the next 4 years, 8 years, several decades. And I think who the next president is will very much influence that. If you look at what the Trump administration has done, I think they very obviously view China as a threat, an enemy even. You can see that in the rhetoric from the Trump administration. You can see that in the unilateral trade war he does. You can even see that in just simple things like calling the coronavirus the Chinese plague over and over. So that rhetoric is very obvious. Now, I think the politics in the US has obviously shifted in the last 4 or 8 years. And certainly it's much more complicated now with China. I think Vice President Biden will try to engage with China with the rest of the world and continue the work of bringing it back into the world order and shaping the relationship into one that is more cooperative and friendly. And we have to do that because, you know, as I answered Edward's question earlier, China's going to be around. It's such a large country, so many people, such as a big economy that we have to deal with it. And there's no way that we can just treat it as a man enemy, even if we wanted to, and expect to continue operating in the world that we have today.
Thank you. My question for Vice President Pence is also on China. I've followed very closely the very important pronouncement of Vice President Pence on China. I think of the members of the Trump administration, he more than anybody else had delivered a substantive, coherent view on China. He did this in October 2018 and again in October 2019. But when I read those two speeches, I felt very concerned because I feel as if I'm hearing the leader of the United States announcing a cold war with China, that he had demonized the Chinese Communist Party. He declared that this is an ideological contest, an economic contest, a technology contest, a diplomatic contest, and a legal contest. So could you explain to us what is the Trump-Pence view of China?
I think that it will be important for the US and China to have good relations at some point in time. I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is correct the wrongs of the past 2 decades of trade issues between the two countries. I think the rhetoric has heated up a little bit. I've been in this region for a long time, and the South China Sea issues are popping up a lot more now than they have in the past 15, 20 years, that's for sure. So I think the rhetoric from certain members of the administration may be a little hotter than what it seemed to be in the past. But I do think it's crucial that US and China fix the wrongs and then look for a path to the future. I don't think that they can ignore each other. I think to your questions, competitor or thing, I think the answer is both to both of your questions that you asked Vice President Biden. Because realistically, I think it's what Trump wants to do on trade is make trade work for American people in America. And I think that that's something that they've felt has been abused in a number of ways. There's a lot of freedoms that Chinese companies may have in the United States that American companies don't necessarily have in China, around issues on intellectual property, data localization, things like that. So I think what we're trying to do is have fair reciprocal trade with not only China, with all the nations that America deals with.
Thank you. My question for Senator Harris, it's a friendly one. I think many of us in Asia were delighted that Vice President Joe Biden chose as his running mate a woman who is the product of a mixed marriage and whose late mother was from Chennai, Tamil Nadu. So the question that many Asians would like to ask Senator Harris is, if you were elected Vice President of the United States, will you champion America's friendship with Asia in a very strategic way? What is your view of Asia?
Well, thank you for that question. And at some level, I think it's difficult to separate the personal from the professional when you're talking about a level of family and core beliefs. So of course, I think we've seen that Senator Harris feels deeply tied to her Asian roots and specifically to her Indian roots. And I think that we've seen that she feels deeply tied to her mother, whom she credits as the woman who has meant more than anyone in the world, really, in terms of shaping who she has become and who she has become in professional capacity and a personal capacity. So all of that is to say that, of course, I think that Asia is a key player in the world. And we've talked a lot about China here this evening, and of course we should. They're a major power. But India is also an enormously significant economy, as are the economies of the ASEAN countries, right? And I think that anyone who ignores this region does so at their peril. This is a region that is rich in cultures and diversity, and rich in economy, and rich in ideas, right? So to sort of help make change in the world. So I think from everything that we've seen so far, from what Senator Harris has said, that she believes that strong root and strong relationships with Asian countries is going to be very significant in the future.
Thank you. I think it's time for me to ask each of you to make a persuasive closing statement on behalf of your candidate. So may I begin with you, Tina? You have 3 minutes. Please remind all of us why we should vote for President Trump.
Well, I think it's important for all of you to understand that I'm talking about the American people, and I'm not specifically talking to the students here at NUS. But the reason the American people will vote for President Trump is that even on a national scale, 57% of Americans that were polled say that they are better off under the Trump administration than they were 4 years ago. That was a national poll that was done. And when you have a community that's believing in their general life, whether it's their own personal beliefs being honored and respected, whether or not they feel safe going out in their communities, whether or not they want to have the freedom to practice their religion and speak their truth, having to do with whether they want to say Merry Christmas or they want to say Hari Raya without offending somebody that's in the room, that religious freedom comes first. There are many rights that have been been returned to the American people under the Trump administration that were put into question under the end of the Biden administration. And those personal freedoms that the people came to the polls to vote for in 2016, if we want to take the money out of it, the business side out of it, the jobs out of it, just how it actually personally touched you, the changes that you were being forced to have to be brought into your own personal home. President Trump has gone out of his way to address those concerns on behalf of the American people and make them feel that they are more in control of their own life without the government being involved in every aspect of what they do, whether or not they can choose what bathroom they go to, or whether or not they can decide what dressing room they change in and they feel safe. This sounds strange, but there is a reason that President Trump won the election in 2016, and that the people came out as a groundswell for him is because they felt that their personal rights were being threatened. And he has done an incredible job in returning those personal rights. Now, from a business standpoint, if you have a job in the United States and you have your health insurance, where 180 million people have their health insurance through their jobs, you're going to support President Trump because you like your health care and you want to keep your health care. This is a question that we have, and there's been a lot of discussions tonight about healthcare in the United States. 180 million people in America have their healthcare through their jobs. We have 320 million people in the United States. So that's more than half of the people in the United States have their healthcare through their jobs. We do have a social support system in the United States called Medicare and Medicaid, and there is healthcare for people that are downtrodden and need help. That structure has been in the United States for years and years. So again, my candidate will be reelected in the United States because the American people believes their lives are better and look forward to getting through the coronavirus and watch their life be better again. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeb, would you like to carry on and give a closing speech on behalf of Vice President Penn?
Thank you, for Professor Koh. Absolutely. I think that as we started this conversation tonight, we talked about promises made, promises kept. I think the American people know what this Trump administration has done in our first term. I believe that people are smarter than a lot of Democrats give them credit for. And I believe that they're going to vote again for the Trump administration for a second term. We've achieved a lot. When you look at multilateral institutions, our colleagues on the other side called out how great they are, how important they are. They absolutely are, but they're not perfect. It doesn't mean they're perfect. You have to fix problems where they're needed. If we look at what Donald Trump has done with NATO, you have a lot more members of NATO now paying the 2% of GDP for the NATO alliance, 20% expenditure on equipment as called for under the original agreement. So multilateral agreements are important, they're good, but they need to actually work. So you can't just sign an agreement and let it run free rein without kind of keeping checks and balances on it. I think the president has done a good job on the economy. If we look pre-pandemic, the lowest unemployment rate for Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, and all Americans. The economy was hotter than it's been in 5 decades, with record low numbers of unemployed. The president has led a number of initiatives that he doesn't get enough credit for from the international community. I've been alive for 50 years. Middle East has problems for more than 50 years. Donald J. Trump and his administration has signed 3 normalization agreements in the last 2 months with UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan just last week. That's expected to continue, and they're going to add more and more nations. And I think this is the most progress I've seen in the Middle East to date. The president also has a plan for a 2-state solution for the Palestinians and Israelis. This is talked about a lot. Nothing ever happens. He is not an all talk, no action president. This administration is not an all talk, no action administration. I think that the Trump administration has done a great job in the Indo-Pacific, building the Quad military and political alliance with India, Australia, Japan. And I think that that's going to be more important as the threats rise and tensions in the South China Sea continue. So what we want to do is stall those, and the Trump administration is the right one to do it. Trump promises stuff, he keeps his promises. He's not an all talk, no action politician. We've seen flip-flopping all over the board, whether it be the Green New Deal that Kamala Harris supported and now she doesn't, whether it be things that are not affordable, universal health care for all. $27 trillion we are in debt. We cannot afford these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Pong?
Democracy, justice, peace, progress, equality. You know what these are. They're the Singaporean and American values and ideals that we share. Now you heard all of us present our case to you. And I think based on the science, the data, the facts, it's clear that from a policy perspective, we have the better, in many cases, only plan to address the historic crises facing America today. The worst pandemic and economic crisis in 100 years, the most urgent call for racial justice in a generation, and an existential threat to the world from climate change. But I wanted to bring us back to these basic values because behind each and every one of the issues that we discussed and debated today, behind all of the numbers and statistics and studies is ultimately a choice about who we want to be as a people. And you've seen who this president is and what he's done. You've seen him defend neo-Nazis and Klansmen. You've seen him lie shamelessly and bully and denigrate minorities and everyone who doesn't agree with him. You've seen him fail at the most basic task of governance, which is to protect our people. And you've seen him choose time and time again the interests of corporations over our planet and the powerful and the wealthy over our poor and marginalized. Joseph Biden is a good and decent man who has spent his life in public service and shares our values, and he would take America back into the path towards one day realizing them. So to end, I'd like to quote him. This is a life-changing election that will determine America's future for a very long time. Character is on the ballot. Compassion is on the ballot. Decency, sciency, democracy, they are all on the ballot. Who we are as a nation, what we stand for, and most importantly, who we want to be. That's all on the ballot, and the choice could not be clearer. So to my Singaporean friends and family, think hard about your values and vote on them. And to my American friends and family who may be watching, do the same. And on November 3rd, from dog catcher to president, vote blue, vote proud, vote them out. Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Dina, your closing statement.
I am so proud to speak on behalf of Senator Harris today. What an amazing individual. A child of immigrants, she has become the only Black woman in a 100-person U.S. Senate. And as she has noted, for every office that she has won, district attorney, attorney general, U.S. senator, she has had to be the first woman of color, first person of color, first woman, constantly having to be the first. And when we win this election, she will not only be the first female vice president, the first Black vice president, and also the first Asian American vice president. That's incredibly exciting, and I could not be more honored to speak on her behalf. Senator Harris is a woman who knows that public service is a noble cause and that the fight for justice is a shared responsibility, whether that be environmental justice, racial justice, or justice for all humans across the planet. She knows that the vast majority of Americans are good and fair and just, and they want their country to reflect those ideals. She knows that we deserve better, and we can do so much more. Now let's be clear about 2016. The people did not vote for Trump. The popular election was won by Hillary Clinton. President Trump won by virtue of a very old American establishment called the Electoral College that I certainly don't have time to explain right now. My colleagues have talked about what you see on television. What you see on television, actually no matter what channel you watch, is real, and what you see on television is concerning. And what you see on television is why we need change. Because what you see on television is a country that is divided racially, economically, politically, and a country that is literally, right now, devastatingly on fire. Where does the solution to that lie? That's what we need to be asking. The solution to that lies in science over fiction. The solution to that lies in hope over fear. And the solution to that lies in unity over division. We do need to make America great, and we cannot make America hate. We have to bring America together. And with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, we can do that. Thank you very much to everyone for having us here this evening. Thank you to the students. I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak on behalf of such a wonderful and important platform.
Thank you. Thank you. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Ko. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are opening the votes now. Please click on the vote button that you see on your Zoom window. Okay, we'll give you about 2 minutes so that, and then I'll announce the results. While we wait for the vote to come in, I have a message for Tembusu College students. This is the third mock US presidential debate. In 2012, the students successfully voted in President Obama, but in 2016, the students got it wrong. A week from now, we will know how our results tonight compare with that of the American electorate. Professor Ko has requested that we host a watch party for the election results. Let's plan to do that by zones in different physical venues. Thank you. Okay, the results are still coming in. It looks like the Democratic Party is taking lead. We have 24 seconds left. Please vote if you have not done so. Five seconds left. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the results are in. We have 87% for the Democratic Party, 13% for the Republican Party. So I declare the winner for tonight's mock US presidential debate, the Democratic Party. Yay. Over to you, Prof. Ko.
We will know on the 4th of November whether the student got it right or whether they got it wrong again. And anyway, we should remember that the popular vote is not the deciding factor, but the Electoral College, you know. Anyway, I'd like to bring this evening to a close, and I would like to thank very much Tina and Jeff and you, Pong, and Tina for four brilliant performances. I want to also thank the 4 students who worked very hard in thinking of what to ask you, composing the question. So Jordan, Edward, Daryl, and Rahul, all 4 of you did a very good job. Thank you. So thank you all very much. And we will know on the 4th of November whether the student got it right or not. But it's a very, very enriching evening. Thank you.